Imagine coming home to find a luminous alien woman in your living room, accusing you of abandoning her across the stars. Her voice cuts through the city's hum with a question that shatters your reality. Why did you leave me, human? This isn't just a strange encounter. It's the beginning of a journey into memories you never knew you had, and a past that could rewrite everything you thought was true about yourself and the universe. The city sounds outside Martin's apartment window seemed to soften as she appeared, as if the traffic and distant sirens were holding their breath. He stood there with his keys still in hand, frozen halfway to the kitchen where he'd been heading for a beer. The normal Thursday evening routine shattered by impossible intrusion. Her form glowed with a soft light that seemed to swallow the shadows in the room, making his beige walls and IKEA furniture look faded and temporary by comparison. She wasn't transparent exactly, but substantial in a way that defied the ordinary physics of his world. Her presence pressing against the air itself. Martin could feel the hair on his arms rise, a primal response to something that shouldn't exist in his neat, mortgaged existence. She spoke again, and this time the words carried weight beyond their syllables. Why did you leave me? Each word seemed to resonate through the room, vibrating through the floorboards and rattling the framed prints on the walls. Her voice held layers of meaning Martin couldn't parse. Betrayal, yes, but also something like grief. And beneath that, a depth of history that stretched back further than his 32 years on Earth. This wasn't some random home invasion. That much became immediately clear. Her eyes, if they were eyes, held recognition, a familiarity that chilled him more than her sudden appearance. She knew him in ways he didn't know himself, saw connections where he saw only the blank space of his own memory. The accusation wasn't about forgetting an anniversary or missing a date. This felt ancient. Martin's mind raced through logical explanations, hallucination, prank, mental breakdown, but each possibility crumbled against the solid reality of her presence. The air carried the scent of ozone and something else, something like night-blooming flowers from a climate Earth didn't possess. Her form shifted slightly, the light around her pulsing with what might have been emotion. The question hung between them, reshaping everything in the room. His coffee table became not just furniture, but evidence of a life built on forgetting. The view of the city skyline through his window transformed from urban landscape to hiding place. Every mundane detail of his existence suddenly felt like a carefully constructed fiction. And she was the truth bleeding through the edges. Her luminous hands gestured slightly, and Martin noticed they weren't quite human in their proportion, the fingers longer and more articulated. The movement seemed to pull at something in his chest, a tug of recognition that terrified him more than the supernatural display. This being new things about him that he'd never told anyone, remembered moments that didn't exist in his memory. The emotional weight of her presence pressed down on him, a physical force that made breathing difficult. This wasn't just about him abandoning her, though that accusation alone would have been devastating enough. There was scope to her grief that suggested consequences far beyond their personal history. Implications that stretched across star systems and civilizations. He finally found his voice, the words coming out cracked and uncertain. I don't know what you're talking about. The protest sounded feeble even to his own ears, a child's denial in the face of overwhelming evidence. She tilted her head, and the light around her shifted again. You will, she said, and the certainty in her tone felt like a verdict. Then she began to show him why his comfortable Earth life had always been a lie. Martin backed against his own front door, the cold wood pressing through his shirt. His mind scrambled for an earthbound explanation. Carbon monoxide leak, sleep deprivation, some elaborate corporate prank. He gripped the door handle behind him like an anchor to the normal world. Look, I don't know who you are or what game you're playing, he started, his voice tighter than he wanted. But this isn't... She cut him off. Not with words, but with a gesture. Her luminous hand rose, palm open, and between them in the air a complex pattern of light congealed. It wasn't a hologram. It had depth, texture, a faint hum that Martin felt in his teeth. It looked like a neural network diagram from a biology textbook, if the textbook had been written by aliens. This was not a feeling, she said, her voice devoid of warmth now. Pure clinical explanation. It was architecture. The glowing web pulsed. A mutual construction, a fusion of thought and sensation into a stable structure. We built this, Martin stared. The pattern was beautiful and terrifying. It looked less like a metaphor for love and more like a schematic for a power grid. Your people have synapses, electrical impulses across gaps, she continued, her tone that of a scientist describing a primitive technology. We forge pathways, physical, traceable connections that bridge individual consciousness. They leave signatures, resonances. They can be mapped, measured, severed. The light between them flickered and a section of the intricate web dissolved into fading embers. Or broken. The diagram shifted, zooming in. What looked like a single thread of light resolved into countless finer filaments, a cable of intertwined experiences, shared memories, and what Martin could only understand as a permanent alignment of perspective. It wasn't that they felt the same way. It was that for a time they were a single, more complex way of perceiving. Our bond was a restructuring, she said. And for the first time, he heard the echo of that loss in her voice, not as emotion but as a factual reporting of damage. You didn't just leave me. You created a rupture in a network you were part of. A network that others relied upon for stability, for navigation, for coherence. The glow of the structure dimmed, leaving after-images on Martin's vision. He understood then. His 9-to-5 job, his weekly grocery run, his entire comfortable, mundane life on Earth. It wasn't just a life he'd built. It was a life built on something. A conscious, desperate suppression of a larger, more terrifying truth. A truth with consequences. His personal betrayal, his failure to remember a lover, was a minor tremor on the surface of a far deeper cataclysm. The echo of what he'd done hadn't just hurt her. It had reverberated through a civilization that used such bonds as foundational elements. His choice to forget had collateral damage. His identity wasn't just his own. It was entangled with beings whose very survival might hinge on recovered connections, on repaired structures. His small human story of love and loss was merely one frayed thread in a vast torn tapestry of interstellar catastrophe. He wasn't a man who'd forgotten a girlfriend. He was a failed architect of a cosmic bridge, and the collapse was still happening somewhere to someone. The weight of it pressed down, making the air in his cheap apartment feel thin and inadequate. Martin's hand went up, a reflexive barrier. You're not putting that on me. The device in Keith's hands looked like no technology he'd ever seen. It wasn't sleek chrome or glowing plastic. It was organic almost. A dull, metallic gray sphere the size of a large orange, its surface swirling with patterns that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. It hummed with a low frequency he felt in his molars, a vibration that was both alien and unsettlingly familiar. It didn't look like a tool. It looked like a live thing, patient and knowing. His earthbound mind raced for excuses, a sophisticated con, a hallucination triggered by stress. But the rationalizations felt flimsy against the solid, humming weight of the object in her hands. The air in the room tasted different now, charged with ozone and the scent of rain on hot stone, a smell that had no business in his carpeted apartment. His skepticism was a wall, but the unease was a crack growing right down the middle. She didn't argue. She simply held the sphere and it unfolded, not with hinges or seams, but with a silent reconfiguration of its own material, segments sliding apart to reveal a cool, blue light, pulsing gently at its core. It wasn't a scanner. It was an interrogator. It does not ask for permission, Keith said, her voice flat. It finds what was hidden. It follows the scars. Before he could pull away, the light lanced out, not a beam, but a tendril of cool energy that connected the sphere to his temple. There was no pain, no heat. Just a sudden, profound sense of intrusion, like a key sliding into a lock he never knew he possessed. The device was accessing pathways in his mind that weren't on any human map, roads built for a different kind of traffic entirely. It bypassed his conscious resistance and went straight for the buried foundations. His vision whited out, not into blindness, but into a flood of impossible imagery. A landscape of rolling hills that pulsed with a gentle internal light, grasses swaying to a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat, a sky with 2 small moons, one tinged violet, casting soft shadows. He understood the whisper of wind through strange, crystalline trees without knowing how. The language wasn't heard. It was known. It felt like remembering the shape of his own hands. Then he saw her. Keith. But not as she stood before him now. She was laughing, her luminescence warm against a sunset that painted an alien horizon in colors Earth didn't have a name for. The memory carried a visceral punch of emotion. affection deep and certain, and a sense of home so profound it ached. His rational mind flailed, trying to categorize the experience as a dream, a fabrication. But the sensory details were too rich, too coherent. The weight of her hand in his, the specific sound of her laughter, the taste of the air. These weren't the blurry impressions of a fantasy. They were the sharp, clear edges of a recalled life. The technology was a brutal fusion of speculative science and emotional archaeology. It didn't just show him data. It made him relive the moments. It dragged the suppressed past into the present and made it more real than the apartment around him. His reluctance, his fear, his desperate clinging to a comfortable lie, none of it mattered. The truth wasn't a theory to be debated. It was a bone-deep memory now excavated, the neural link severed. The sphere closed itself, the light dying. Martin stood gasping, his knees weak. The afterimage of twin moons burned onto his retinas. The scent of alien rain still lingered in his nose. He looked at Keith, really looked at her, and the recognition was there, shattering and absolute. The device hadn't just shown him fragments. It had proven beyond any argument that his entire identity was a shell built over a deliberately suppressed past. The past was real, and it was waiting. The scent of coffee from Martin's own kitchen was suddenly, stupidly present, a normal smell in a conversation that had left normal far behind. He sagged against his sofa, the worn fabric scratchy through his shirt. He needed answers that weren't just about his own blank spaces. "Okay," he said, the words sounding drained. "Start at the beginning. What war? What civilization are you even from?" Keith's light seemed to dim slightly, not from weakness but as if drawing inward, focusing the facts. "My people are the AIA," she began, her voice gaining a formal, recounting tone. "Our society was not built on governments or economies as you know them. It was structured around the bonds. The neural connections you just remembered. They were our infrastructure. Our communication. Our collective memory. They held everything together." She described a civilization that sounded less like a nation and more like a single, vast, interconnected organism. The bonds allowed for instant sharing of knowledge, emotion, and purpose across star systems. It was a society of profound unity, but that unity created a specific, terrible vulnerability. "Then came the fracture," she said, and the air in the room seemed to chill. "An external force. An enemy that understood our weakness. They didn't attack our ships or our cities first. They targeted the bonds themselves. They developed a resonance frequency that could sever them, not just disconnect. It was a weapon that caused a feedback loop. The severance itself created a wave of traumatic psychic shock that would travel back through the network. The exodus wasn't a planned evacuation. It was a catastrophic system failure, a cascade of severed connections that collapsed their entire way of being. The shockwaves didn't just kill people. They erased the very foundations of their society. Whole sectors of knowledge, history, and culture were lost instantly. The collective consciousness shattering into billions of isolated, traumatized fragments. Humans, she explained, had a different neural architecture, more insulated. Some AIA, in a desperate bid for survival, had forged connections with human minds, creating hybrid bonds that were more resistant to the weapon. But these bonds came with a cost. The human mind, unable to process the scale of the loss, the sheer weight of shared trauma from a dying civilization, did the only thing it could to survive. It broke. It suppressed everything. "Your departure was not a choice made in calm reflection," Keith stated, her gaze unwavering. "It was an act of a mind under siege. You are not running from me. You were running from the memory of the collapse. Your mind, to protect itself, rewrote the story. It turned a strategic, desperate retreat into a simple story of abandonment. Your life here." She gestured at the apartment, the comfortable, mundane prison he'd built. "This is not a life you built. It is a life you built on top of the ruin. It is conscious suppression, a bunker against a truth too large to face." The weight of it flattened him. This wasn't about a failed relationship. His actions, his flight, his amnesia, they weren't a personal failure. They were a symptom of a civilization-wide trauma. His story was a single thread in a tapestry of interstellar catastrophe. His perceived betrayal had likely been a desperate last-ditch effort to preserve something. A piece of technology, a sliver of knowledge, a single viable bond, by getting it as far from the epicenter as possible. He hadn't just left her. He had been deployed, and his own mind had scuttled the mission to save the soldier. The guilt he felt was real, but its origin was a lie. He wasn't a coward. He was a casualty, and the war wasn't over. The locator sphere led them to a small coffee shop tucked between a dry cleaner and a hardware store. It was the kind of place that smelled of burned coffee grounds and toasted bagels, all faded linoleum and the low hum of a refrigeration unit. The sphere, resting in Keith's palm, pulsed with a steady, soft light that felt out of place among the chipped mugs and sugary syrup pumps. It had hummed louder as they approached the counter, resonating with a frequency only they could sense. The man behind the counter looked utterly ordinary. Late 50s, maybe, with a beard going gray and a faded apron tied over a sweatshirt. He moved with the automatic, tired grace of someone who'd been pulling espresso shots for 20 years. He wiped the steam wand with a damp cloth, not looking up as they approached. "What can I get you?" Then the sphere pulsed again, brighter. Keith held it up. The man, Jorth, froze. His eyes, a pale blue behind wire-rimmed glasses, flicked from the device to Keith's face, then to Martin. The easy weariness in his posture evaporated, replaced by a stiff, watchful tension. The fear in his eyes was immediate and deep, a look Martin recognized. It was the same fear he'd felt when Keith first appeared in his living room. Keith didn't speak. She simply tilted her head, a silent question. The coffee machine hissed, a sharp sound in the sudden silence. He was a scholar, she'd said the sphere indicated. Not a soldier. His hands, now gripping the edge of the counter, were stained with coffee grounds, but their shape, the long fingers, echoed Keith's. They were hands that might have once held delicate instruments, or turned the pages of texts written in light. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered, his voice rough. He glanced toward the door as if expecting someone else to walk in. "It's not safe." His choice to hide here in this anonymous corner of Earth made a terrible kind of sense. This was the simplicity so many of them had craved after the fracture. A life with no connections, no bonds, no terrifying responsibility. A life where the biggest problem was a broken espresso machine. He hadn't just been hiding from their enemies. He'd been hiding from the memory of what was lost. He confirmed it all in hushed, rushed sentences between serving customers. The exodus wasn't a clean break. It was a frantic, chaotic shattering. The resistance, what was left of it, had fragmented, scattering members across star systems, across galaxies, with no way to know who had survived. Earth, with its primitive technology and blissful ignorance of interstellar politics, became a favorite dumping ground for refugees, a place to disappear. His presence changed everything for Martin. This was no longer just about his personal guilt or his fractured bond with Keith. It was a historical reckoning. They weren't two people trying to fix a broken relationship. They were fragments of a shattered civilization trying to find each other in the dark. The mission instantly widened, its scope becoming terrifyingly vast. It was no longer about retrieving a single memory. It was about retrieving a culture. Trust was the new currency, and it had to be built across species, across shattered memories, across layers of trauma. Jorth was afraid of them, of what their presence might attract. They had to convince him that staying hidden was a slower death. Martin watched the fear war with a dawning, terrible hope in the scholar's eyes and understood his own reflection in it. He wasn't alone in his amnesia. He was one of thousands, a single point of light in a constellation of forgotten souls, all needing to remember who they were. The hiss of the steam wand sounded like a sigh. The coffee machine hissed steam as Jorth wiped the counter with a cloth, his movements practiced and automatic. His hands moved with the efficiency of someone who'd performed this ritual thousands of times. Yet there was a precision to his motions that seemed out of place. A scholar's careful attention in a barista's simple task. When Martin and Keith entered, he didn't look up immediately, just finished polishing a spot near the espresso handle with focused intensity. He finally glanced toward them, and his eyes widened slightly at Keith's luminous form. The cloth stilled in his hand. For a moment his posture shifted, shoulders straightening as if accustomed to carrying heavier responsibilities than coffee orders. Then the moment passed and he was just a cafe worker again, offering a polite customer service smile that didn't reach his eyes. Keith spoke first, using words that meant nothing to Martin, but made Jorth's professional demeanor fracture completely. The language carried cadences that felt ancient, consonants formed in ways human vocal cords couldn't manage. Jorth's response came haltingly at first, then with growing fluency as something in him unlocked. He had been a historian on AIA, he explained once they moved to a back room. His specialty was neural archaeology, studying how civilization stored memory and collective consciousness. When the Exodus began, he'd been part of the resistance trying to preserve knowledge rather than weapons. Earth hadn't been chosen for its resources or strategic value. It was selected for its simplicity, its relatively primitive technology that couldn't detect their presence, its psychological stability that helped suppress their memories. The hiding was necessary, he said. The forces that shattered their civilization hunted survivors across systems. They'd developed technology that could detect AIA neural signatures across light years. Earth's electromagnetic noise and biological similarity provided cover, like hiding a specific leaf in a forest. The amnesia wasn't just side effect, it was survival strategy. Remembering could have drawn attention that would have endangered this world too. His coffee shop existence represented the broader conflict. The resistance hadn't been warriors but archivists, scientists, teachers, people who valued preservation over combat. They'd endured the collapse by burying themselves so completely that even they forgot what they were. The trauma of that choice showed in his eyes when he spoke of colleagues who hadn't made it, of knowledge lost because carrying it would have been too dangerous. Trust built slowly between them. Jorth's memories were fragmented, surfacing in patches like damaged film. He recalled the final days better than Martin, the desperate evacuation, the painful severing of bonds, the conscious decision to become less than they were to survive. His hands trembled slightly when he described the moment he chose to forget everything he'd spent his life studying. They began coordinating carefully. Jorth still had access to fragments of resistance protocols, communication methods that used mundane Earth technology in specific patterns. His cafe became their first operational base, a place where recovery plans could be made behind the comforting normality of coffee grinders and steamed milk. The work felt fragile, like rebuilding a cathedral with broken glass. The Exodus, he explained, hadn't been a single event but a cascade of failures. Political, technological, ethical. Their civilization had reached a point where their connections became vulnerabilities. The attack exploited their greatest strength, turning their neural networks against them. Forced hiding became the only alternative to complete annihilation. As they prepared to leave, Jorth hesitated at the door. The next phase would require more than trust, he warned. They would need to prove their loyalty in ways that went beyond words or intentions. There were tests designed to break amnesiacs who might be compromised. Protocols from the resistance that hadn't been used in decades. The door to the abandoned warehouse groaned shut behind them, cutting off the sound of rain on the rooftop. The air inside tasted of rust and old concrete. Neuron waited for them in the center of the vast empty space, a tall figure whose silence felt heavier than any greeting. He didn't ask their names or their purpose. He just pointed toward the far wall where 3 pedestals stood under a single hanging light. Each pedestal held an object. On the left, a sphere of dark, swirling smoke that seemed to pull at the light around it. In the center, a crystalline shard that pulsed with a sharp red energy. On the right, a simple, clear crystal that gleamed with a steady white light. No explanations were given. The choice itself was the first test. Martin understood immediately. This wasn't about picking a tool. It was about picking a version of himself. The smoky sphere promised raw power, the thrill of impulse, the chance to act without thinking. The red shard offered volatility, the heat of emotion, the passion to burn through obstacles. The clear crystal represented discipline, clarity, the harder path of facing things as they were. He didn't hesitate long. His hand went to the clear crystal. It felt cool and solid in his palm, its weight a quiet promise of stability. Choosing it meant rejecting the easy escape of anger or unchecked force. It signaled a willingness to endure the truth no matter how difficult, rather than mask it with feeling. It was the choice of a soldier preparing for a long campaign, not a rebel looking for a fight. The moment his fingers closed around it, the warehouse changed. The walls didn't vanish, but they seemed to recede into darkness, the floor becoming a surface of black glass that reflected nothing. The air grew cold and the only light came from the crystal in his hand, casting long, nervous shadows. Then the whispers started. They weren't voices so much as thoughts given sound, his own deepest fears amplified and given a cruel clarity. You left them to die. The words hung in the air, icy and precise. You chose to save yourself. They trusted you and you ran. You always run. They echoed the accusation Kaith had first leveled at him, but twisted, sharper, aimed at vulnerabilities he didn't even know he had. Images flickered at the edges of his vision. Faces from the Exodus. People he'd half remembered from the Neoscope's visions, their expressions shifting from trust to betrayal. The whispers morphed into screams of panic, the sounds of a civilization collapsing, and beneath it all the relentless, quiet accusation. This is your fault. You could have stayed. You could have fought. You abandoned them. It was a psychological assault designed to break him, to confirm his own deepest suspicions about himself. The test wasn't about external monsters. It was about forcing him to stand alone in a room with the person he was most afraid he was. A coward, a failure, a man defined by abandonment. The crystal in his hand felt heavier, its cool clarity a lifeline against the rising tide of manufactured self-blame. He didn't try to argue with the voices. He didn't try to shout them down. He just held on to the crystal, focusing on its solid reality, its promise of order. He let the fear wash over him, acknowledged it, and then made the conscious choice to set it aside. He managed it. He didn't eliminate it. He redirected it. The darkness receded. The whispers faded. The warehouse was just a warehouse again, smelling of wet concrete and dust. Neuron gave a single, slow nod. The test was over. Martin's choice and his ability to withstand the subsequent onslaught proved he had the resolve necessary to continue. He had faced the worst version of himself and chosen to act anyway. The victory was small, but it was real. It secured the aid they needed. His hand unclenched from the crystal. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach, but it was no longer in control. It was a thing to be managed, a weight to be carried, not a wall to stop him. The path forward wasn't about being fearless. It was about making fear irrelevant to the work that needed to be done. The forest that grew around Martin wasn't made of wood and leaf. It was constructed from memory and accusation, a labyrinth of his own deepest fears given physical form. The air tasted like static and shame. Branches reached for him with the skeletal fingers of those he'd left behind, and the ground beneath his feet felt unstable, like walking on frozen doubts. Every shadow held a shape he almost recognized. The whispers didn't come from the trees. They came from inside his skull, using his own voice, his own thoughts twisted into weapons. You ran when they needed you. The words weren't spoken. They were implanted, cold and certain. You chose your own survival over their lives. You always choose yourself. They echoed the exact fears that had haunted him since Kaith first appeared, amplified to a deafening roar. This wasn't random psychological noise. It was a targeted assault, a precision strike against the foundations of his self-worth. Images flickered at the edges of the path, glimpses of the Exodus he'd only partially remembered. People he should have known, their faces contorted in fear and betrayal, reaching for him as he turned away. The memories felt real, visceral, laden with emotional weight the Neoscope had only hinted at. The forest was weaponizing his guilt, feeding him a curated nightmare built from his own regrets and insecurities. The experience threatened to drown him in a version of himself he feared was true. A coward, a failure, a man defined by abandonment. Kaith stood a few paces away, a steady point of light in the shifting gloom. She didn't speak. She didn't try to fight the whispers for him. Her presence was simply there, an anchor in the storm, a reminder that the reality outside this constructed torture was still waiting. Her silence was more powerful than reassurance. It was a statement of fact: this is a test and I am still here. Her calm focus provided a fixed point he could use to orient himself against the psychological onslaught. This internal landscape was something he had to navigate, not destroy. The forest was a part of him, a manifestation of the shame he'd carried since waking up on Earth with half a memory. Conquering it didn't mean cutting down every tree. It meant finding a path through without being torn apart by the thorns. Each step forward was an act of defiance against the narrative of failure the whispers preached. He stopped trying to block out the accusations. Instead, he acknowledged them. Yes, I left. Yes, I was afraid, but he refused to let the confession be the end of the story. The responsibility he felt wasn't a chain to hold him down. It was a compass. The guilt could be redirected. It could become the fuel for making things right, rather than the proof that he never could. Ahead, on a stump that looked too much like a funeral altar, rested the sphere they'd come for. It pulsed with a soft, steady light, a promise of clarity in the heart of the confusion. The whispers intensified as he approached, screaming their final condemnations. "You don't deserve to finish this. You'll only fail them again." His hand closed around the sphere. The cool, solid reality of it was a shock against the manufactured horrors. The forest didn't vanish. The whispers didn't stop. But their power over him broke. He had faced the worst possible version of his own story and chosen to move forward anyway. He had managed the fear, not eliminated it, and that was the only victory that mattered. Retrieving the sphere was more than completing a task. It was a symbolic act of reclaiming his agency from his own self-sabotage. He had proven that his sense of responsibility could be a tool for construction, not just a weapon for self-punishment. The fear was still there, a cold companion at his side, but it was no longer the guide. He was. The resonance tuner hummed with a sound Martin felt in his bones before he heard it in his ears. Keith held the device between them, its surface shifting with patterns that mirrored the neural pathways it was about to access. It didn't work through screens or interfaces. It plugged directly into the architecture of memory, connecting his individual consciousness to the wider resonance network of their people. The process would be less like watching a film and more like reliving a life he'd forgotten. When the connection clicked into place, the world didn't fade. It flooded. Memories arrived not as single images but as layered experiences, sights, sounds, emotions, and context arriving simultaneously. A ceremony under twin moons wasn't just a personal milestone. He saw the cultural significance now, the intricate choreography that celebrated not just their bond, but the creation of a new neural pathway for their civilization. The celebration carried the weight of scientific achievement and cultural tradition intertwined. The war memories arrived with brutal clarity alongside the personal ones. No longer abstract concepts described by Keith or Jorth, but visceral experiences. The fracture wasn't a historical event. It was the smell of burning ozone as resonance weapons hit their marks, the screams that weren't just sound waves but psychic shock waves tearing through connected minds. He felt the collective panic as their networked consciousness began to fail, entire sectors of shared knowledge going dark. His choice on that final day emerged from the confusion with terrible precision. It wasn't a simple decision between fight or flight. It was a calculation of sacrifice. Staying with the main resistance force meant certain death, not just for him, but for the knowledge he carried, the specific neural patterns that might be used to rebuild. Leaving offered a terrible hope, the chance to preserve a seed of their civilization far from the conflict. The faces of those he left behind resolved from the emotional fog. Their expressions carried sorrow, yes, but also a grim determination. They weren't watching a betrayal. They were witnessing a desperate deployment. Hands had pressed the data crystal into his palm. Not just mission parameters, but cultural archives, scientific principles, the core of what needed to survive. Their farewells weren't accusations. They were prayers. He remembered the exact moment his ship cleared the atmosphere, looking down at the world tearing itself apart. The grief had been immediate and overwhelming. A pain so profound his human mind couldn't contain it. The memory suppression hadn't been a choice so much as a biological failsafe. His brain protecting itself from trauma it wasn't equipped to handle. The resonance tuner showed him the full context his amnesia had erased. His departure wasn't abandonment. It was extraction. He hadn't run from responsibility. He'd been given the most terrible responsibility imaginable. The guilt he'd carried wasn't for leaving people to die, but for failing a mission he couldn't remember accepting. The moral complexity of it settled over him, heavy, but clarifying. There were no clean choices in catastrophe, only different types of sacrifice. His had been the loneliness of preservation, rather than the nobility of last stands. The shame he'd felt was a relic of fragmented memory, a story his traumatized mind had constructed to make sense of the unbearable. The device disconnected with a soft click. Martin found himself breathing hard, tears on his face for people whose names he now remembered. The weight in his chest wasn't guilt anymore. It was purpose, reframed and renewed. He hadn't been a coward. He'd been an archivist of a dying world, and his work was only half done. The realization didn't erase the pain of what was lost, but it gave that pain meaning. He had a reason for surviving that was bigger than his own life. The sphere felt warm against his palm, a smooth weight that seemed to resonate with his pulse. Martin held it carefully, aware that this small object represented everything they'd risked in the forest test. The warmth spread up his arm, a sensation that felt less like heat and more like recognition. This wasn't just a retrieved object, it was an invitation to continue. Neuron's approval came as a simple nod, the barest dip of his chin that nevertheless carried significant weight. His assistance would now be theirs, his resources available for the journey ahead. The test had been the price of admission, and Martin had paid it by facing the whispering forest and coming out with his resolve intact. The small victory felt larger than it should have, a foothold in the steep climb they faced. Martin's past failures now sat beside this waking purpose like two different books on the same shelf. The guilt over his actions during the exodus remained, but it no longer paralyzed him. Instead, it became context for the work ahead, a reminder of what happened when he failed and motivation to not fail again. The sphere in his hand represented a chance to balance the scales. Though he knew some debts could never be fully repaid. The test had ended, but the real work stretched out before them, more complex than any psychological trial. They had proven Martin could handle the emotional onslaught, but the practical challenges would require different strengths. The forest had been about endurance. What came next would be about understanding. His proven resolve felt like a quiet shift inside him, a settling of something that had been unbalanced since Keith first appeared in his living room. He hadn't eliminated his fears or doubts, they still murmured at the edges of his consciousness, but he demonstrated they wouldn't control his actions. The victory was in the doing, not the feeling. Redemption became a dual concept, personal in the sense of reconciling with his own choices, collective in terms of contributing to something larger than himself. The sphere represented both aspects, his chance to understand what he'd done, and his opportunity to help rebuild what had been broken. The two purposes intertwined, each giving meaning to the other. The path forward required embracing both roles, the man who had made terrible choices under pressure, and the man who could use that experience to make better choices now. He couldn't erase his past self, only integrate him into who he needed to become. The sphere seemed to pulse in agreement, its warmth a constant reminder that moving forward meant carrying everything with him. The emotional stakes deepened with this accomplishment. Before, the work had been theoretical, about recovering lost memories and connections. Now it became concrete. Every choice would affect real people, every decision would have consequences beyond himself. The sphere's weight in his hand felt like the weight of responsibility. Finally properly shouldered, the forest test had crystallized his turning point by forcing him to hear his deepest fears spoken aloud and choose action anyway. The whispers had given form to his self-doubt so he could see it for what it was, a barrier, not a truth. Retrieving the sphere became proof that he could operate despite the noise in his head, that his purpose could be stronger than his fear. Neuron produced another device, this one more complex than the sphere. It resembled an intricate metal flower waiting to bloom, its petals folded tightly around a central core that glowed with soft light. This, he explained, would take them deeper than memory retrieval. The device awaited activation, ready to reveal truths that went beyond personal history into the fundamental nature of their connection. The rooftop air carried the metallic tang of the city below, but the resonance network's activation washed everything else away. The device pulsed in Martin's hands, its light patterns shifting from scattered signals to coordinated rhythms. Each pulse represented a life, a story, a mind waiting to reconnect. The network wasn't just finding exiles, it was weaving them back into a community they'd forgotten. Responses began flickering across the device's surface, tiny lights awakening across continents. Not just signals, but voices. A dignified elder's transmission came through first, his words carrying the weight of lost authority tempered by rediscovered hope. He spoke of reassembly protocols, of how their scattered population could begin planning rather than hiding. The activation shifted from technological achievement to cultural awakening. Martin watched the patterns intensify, the device growing warm in his hands. The rooftop vantage point allowed the signals to spread cleaner, reaching exiles who'd buried themselves deeper than others. Each new connection represented another piece of their civilization's puzzle, slotting back into place. The work became less about discovery and more about coordination, less about finding people and more about helping them remember who they were. The elder's voice stabilized, suggesting meeting points, security protocols, methods for safe communication. His tone carried the relief of someone who'd waited decades for this moment. The resistance hadn't been completely destroyed, just frozen in time, waiting for someone to restart the clock. Martin's role evolved in real time, from solitary figure to bridge between disconnected parts. Remnants of AIA began discussing practical matters through the network, resource pooling, skill inventories, security concerns. The conversation carried the quiet excitement of people rediscovering purpose after long dormancy. Earth's simplicity, once their hiding place, now became their operating base, neutral territory where they could rebuild without immediate threat. Martin felt the shift in his own understanding. He wasn't saving anyone. He was facilitating people saving themselves. His place became less about being the hero and more about being the catalyst, the one who'd help them find each other again. The weight felt different, lighter in some ways, more complex in others. The network achieved critical mass, the signals synchronizing into a stable pattern. The device's pulsing settled into a steady rhythm, like a heartbeat restored after cardiac arrest. Martin looked out across the city skyline, imagining the invisible connections forming between apartments, coffee shops, offices, places where people were suddenly remembering they weren't alone. The activation completed with a soft chime from the device. The light patterns held steady, a map of their rediscovered community. Martin's hands finally relaxed their grip, the tension draining from his shoulders. The work would be enormous, the challenges numerous, but the isolation had ended. They were a people again, not just survivors. Meanwhile, in a small apartment 3 blocks away, a woman who'd believed herself human for 40 years suddenly understood why she'd always hated the taste of coffee and loved the smell of ozone before thunderstorms. Her hands, which had spent decades arranging flowers, remembered different work entirely. Martin stood there holding the resonance tuner, the device's gentle hum fading from his temples. The apartment's air still carried the ozone scent of activated technology, but something fundamental had shifted inside him. The memory upload hadn't just given him information. It had restructured his understanding of himself. He could no longer hide behind the comfortable guilt that had defined his Earth life. That simple narrative of abandonment had shattered under the weight of complex truth. The emotional pivot happened quietly, without drama. One moment he was carrying the crushing weight of perceived betrayal. The next he was seeing his choices through the lens of impossible circumstances. His departure from AIA hadn't been cowardice, it had been triage. The faces of those he left behind showed sorrow, yes, but also understanding. They knew why he had to go, even if he'd forgotten their acceptance. The memory reframe turned his self-punishment into pointless theater. His renewed resolve felt different from the determined energy he'd mustered during the forest test. This was quieter, more substantial. It came from understanding rather than effort, from integration rather than suppression. The past actions that had haunted him became foundation instead of obstacle. He could build from his failures rather than be defined by them. The shift felt physical, like a weight lifting from his shoulders that had been there so long he'd forgotten its presence. He accepted the complexity now. Staying would have meant noble failure. Leaving meant carrying the burden of possible success. Neither choice was clean, neither without consequence. The moral clarity he'd craved didn't exist in those final moments on AIA, only difficult choices made under unbearable pressure. His Earth life hadn't been an escape from responsibility, but its continuation in another form. Purpose transformed before his eyes. Redemption became too small a concept, too focused on personal cleansing. Reconstruction offered something larger, the chance to help rebuild what had been broken, to turn survival into renewal. The emotional weight didn't vanish, but it changed character, becoming motivation rather than anchor. He could work with this weight, use it to ground himself rather than be dragged down by it. Understanding arrived not as intellectual knowledge but as bodily recognition. His hands remembered work they hadn't performed in decades, his mind falling into patterns of thought that felt both familiar and new. The resonance tuner had done more than show him memories. It had reconnected neural pathways that had been deliberately severed. He wasn't just remembering who he'd been, he was becoming that person again, tempered by Earth experience. The pivotal revelation wasn't about what he'd done, but why it had been necessary. Seeing the full context, the crumbling civilization, the limited options, the calculated risks, allowed him to finally release the simple story of failure he'd been telling himself. The memory upload gave him back his complexity, his humanity within the alien context. He'd made the best choice available with terrible options, and that was all anyone could have done. The strategic pivot began naturally from this new understanding. His focus shifted from personal reckoning to practical contribution. He started considering how his Earth knowledge could combine with his recovered AIA skills, what unique perspective his dual experience might offer. The work ahead felt less like atonement and more like rebuilding, less about fixing past mistakes and more about creating future possibilities. He looked at Kaith, really seeing her for the first time without the filter of guilt between them. Her presence represented not accusation but partnership, not past failure but future collaboration. The emotional fulcrum had turned, balancing his experiences into something he could finally work with. The memory upload hadn't given him answers so much as the right questions, the proper framework for understanding what came next. The scent of rain on hot pavement drifted through the open window, a normal Earth smell that felt suddenly trivial against their conversation. Martin tried to frame it in human terms, grasping for familiar concepts. So it was like a marriage? A deep friendship? The words sounded inadequate even as he said them. Small containers for something that clearly demanded larger dimensions. Kaith's response held no impatience, only the steady precision of someone explaining fundamental physics to a curious child. No, it was architecture. Her hands moved, and between them a complex lattice of light coalesced, shimmering with intricate patterns. We built structures of shared consciousness, tangible fusions of thought and perception. She described neural pathways that didn't just fire in parallel but actually intertwined, creating hybrid circuits that belonged to both participants equally. These connections left physical evidence in brain chemistry, detectable energy signatures, measurable changes in neural density. The bonds weren't metaphors for closeness. They were verifiable physiological facts, as real as nerve endings and more complex. Severing such connections caused damage beyond emotional trauma. It created literal neural scarring, disrupted cognitive functions, left gaps in memory and perception that couldn't be explained by standard psychology. The pain of separation wasn't just psychological. It was the physical distress of a system trying to function with missing components. Network-wide severances, like during the Exodus, caused cascading failures across entire populations. The cultural reliance on these bonds explained the catastrophic scale of their civilization's collapse. Their society wasn't just connected emotionally, it was structurally interdependent, with shared neural networks handling everything from communication to governance to collective memory. The weapon that severed bonds didn't just cause personal tragedy. It triggered systemic failure, like cutting the neurological connections between all organs in a body simultaneously. Rebuilding required more than emotional reconciliation. It demanded actual neural reconstruction, the careful reweaving of severed pathways across thousands of minds. Personal connections needed restoration, but so did the larger structural networks that allowed their civilization to function. The work was both intimately personal and impersonally technical, requiring medical precision alongside emotional intelligence. Human concepts of romance, friendship, even family, they only captured fragments of what these bonds represented. The AIA connections incorporated elements of all these but operated on different principles. They weren't chosen based on compatibility so much as discovered through resonance. They weren't maintained through effort but through mutual existence. They represented a fundamentally different approach to relationship itself. Martin's human perspective, which had initially seemed like a limitation, began to reveal its value. His experience with Earth's more fragile, negotiated connections gave him insight into building trust gradually, rather than assuming instantaneous neural alignment. His understanding of emotional complexity without physical entanglement offered tools for patience when the bonding process encountered resistance. He began to see how his dual experience could contribute. The human approach to relationship, built on choice, maintained through effort, surviving despite separation, could inform their rebuilding. Sometimes a bond that developed slowly through shared experience might prove more resilient than one that formed through instant neural compatibility. His outsider status became an asset rather than a handicap. The conversation shifted from explanation to collaboration. Martin started asking different questions, not about what the bonds were, but how they could be strengthened, what human approaches to trust building might supplement the AIA neural techniques. His perspective stopped being a filter through which to understand their ways and became a toolkit for improving them. The cultural divide between human and AIA approaches to connection began to seem less like a barrier and more like an opportunity for synthesis. He looked at the shimmering neural lattice between them, no longer seeing it as alien technology, but as a different language for describing something universal. The goal wasn't to choose between human or AIA approaches to relationship, but to find the ways they could inform and strengthen each other. His Earth experience hadn't been wasted time. It had been preparation for this moment of synthesis. Kaith's presence in Martin's apartment shifted from intrusion to anchor point over the following days. The accusatory tension that defined their first encounter softened into something more complex, a shared mission that required both their skills. Her initial question, "Why did you leave me?" became, "I'm here to help you remember," and the change in phrasing signaled everything. The personal grievance expanded to include planetary-scale consequences, the intimate betrayal becoming one thread in a larger catastrophe. Memory cracking evolved into reconstruction work. Where Martin had initially resisted the neoscope, he now sought its clarity willingly. Kaith operated the device with precision, her knowledge of AIA neural architecture making the process less invasive than it might have been. Their sessions became collaborative rather than confrontational, with Martin actively participating in his own rediscovery rather than being subjected to it. The apartment filled with maps and notes instead of just tension, the work spreading across surfaces that had previously held only mundane Earth possessions. Their relationship stabilized the wider renewal effort. As more exiles connected through the network, Martin and Kaith became the consistent center point, the known quantities in a rapidly expanding operation. Their partnership demonstrated that human and AIA could work together effectively, modeling the cross-species collaboration their mission required. The trust between them became foundational, something others could reference when their own doubts arose. Personal longing transformed into coordinated action. Kaith's desire for answers about Martin's abandonment became secondary to their shared goal of reconnecting fractured lives. The emotional energy that might have fueled resentment instead powered their efforts to locate other exiles, understand their situations, and help them regain their memories. What began as a personal quest became a systematic operation with protocols, safety measures, and clear objectives. They worked specifically to connect Exodus-fractured lives, using the locator sphere to find individuals who'd been separated for decades. Each successful contact reinforced their purpose, turning theoretical mission into practical achievement. The work required patience and empathy, understanding that not everyone would welcome the disruption of their Earth lives. They developed approaches tailored to different situations, learning from each encounter. Her insistence became guidance rather than accusation. Where she'd once demanded answers, she now offered support. When Martin expressed apprehension about further memory retrieval, she responded with quiet confidence in his resilience. Her belief in him became a steadying influence, helping him move past doubts that might have stalled their progress. The dynamic shifted from her pushing him toward truth to them moving toward it together. Their bond strengthened through this shared purpose. The neural connection they'd once shared began reestablishing itself naturally, facilitated by their collaborative work, rather than forced through technology. They developed rhythms of communication that bypassed language sometimes, understanding each other's intentions through subtle cues. The partnership felt increasingly natural, the initial strangeness fading into comfortable coordination. Emotional connection supported practical goals directly. Their growing understanding of each other's strengths and limitations allowed them to divide tasks efficiently. Martin's Earth experience complemented Kaith's AIA knowledge, creating approaches that neither could have developed alone. The trust between them made difficult decisions easier, as they could rely on each other's judgment when circumstances demanded quick choices. This evolution from tension to partnership enabled their mission's success. Kaith's support became the constant that allowed Martin to navigate his dual identity without fracturing. Their relationship demonstrated that catastrophe recovery required both emotional and practical components working together. The final constellation of their renewed community formed around this core partnership, its stability encouraging others to reconnect. Martin stood by his apartment window, watching rain streak the glass while memories streaked through his mind. The returned recollections felt less like gifts and more like debts called due, each one arriving with emotional weight that demanded payment. Liberation came at the cost of confronting choices he'd made under unimaginable pressure, the burden of responsibility for actions taken when all options were terrible. The neural pathways might be clearing, but the psychological terrain they revealed was rugged and unforgiving. Each memory carried moral complexity that resisted easy resolution. Remembering the Exodus meant accepting that he'd made life and death decisions with incomplete information, that people had suffered because of his choices, that survival sometimes required sacrificing the few for the many. The clarity of hindsight made every decision look flawed, every alternative seem possible. The emotional toll accumulated like interest on a loan he hadn't realized he'd taken out decades earlier. The process involved grieving for losses he hadn't known he'd sustained. People he'd loved, places he'd called home, achievements he'd worked for, all returned to him as absences rather than possessions. The morning felt peculiar, like attending funerals for people he'd just learned had died years ago. The sadness was fresh, but the events were historical, creating emotional dissonance that left him feeling unmoored in time. His Earth identity began conflicting sharply with his emerging AIA self. The man who'd paid mortgages and worried about career advancement now had to integrate with someone who'd made interstellar survival decisions. The comfortable routines of his human life started feeling like costumes he'd been wearing, yet discarding them meant losing the stability that had sustained him for decades. The psychological friction between these identities created internal tension that no amount of memory recovery could resolve. Kaith provided steady support, but couldn't perform the emotional work for him. She understood the technology of memory recovery, the neural mechanisms, the cultural context, but the personal integration, the weaving together of disparate selves into a coherent whole, was work he had to do alone. Her presence was anchor rather than engine, stable ground rather than moving force. She could remind him of who he'd been, but only he could determine who that meant he should become. The neurological process had psychological consequences that required careful management. Memories returned not as neat narratives but as sensory fragments. The smell of burning ozone, the taste of emergency rations, the sound of evacuation alarms. These pieces didn't automatically arrange themselves into coherent understanding. They needed sorting, contextualizing, reconciling with the person he'd become on Earth. The work felt less like remembering and more like translation between two different languages of self. Integration became the real work, far beyond simple memory recovery. He had to find ways to honor both identities, the AIA survivor and the Earth human, without letting either dominate or dismiss the other. The process wasn't about choosing which self was real, but about building a new identity that could contain both histories. The psychological weight wasn't something to be eliminated, but something to be carried properly, distributed across both sets of experiences. He began the slow work of weaving together his disparate selves, finding points of connection between the man who'd chosen survival during catastrophe and the man who'd learned to appreciate quiet evenings in a safe apartment. The integration wasn't seamless. There were gaps and rough edges where the pieces didn't quite match. But gradually, a more complete understanding began emerging, one that could accommodate both the extraordinary and the ordinary, the catastrophic and the commonplace, the alien and the human. The work was internal, invisible to others, but it felt more significant than any technological activation or network building they'd accomplished. This was the foundation everything else would rest upon. Martin stopped seeing himself as someone who needed to fix everything alone. The realization settled in quietly without fanfare as he watched the energy web pulse above the city. His role wasn't about single-handedly saving anyone. It was about weaving connections between people who could save themselves. The shift felt physical, like a weight redistributing itself across broader shoulders. He accepted his place in the diaspora's reconstruction naturally, without resistance. The work involved coordinating communications, sharing resources, helping others navigate the disorienting process of memory recovery. His apartment became a hub where exiled AIA members could find temporary grounding, a neutral space where they could process their dual identities. The constant flow of people felt right, the shared purpose filling rooms that had felt too empty for too long. The tension remained, though it changed form. Could he truly belong to this community that remembered more than he did? His Earth experiences set him apart even as they made him valuable. His understanding of human society gave him insights others lacked, but his fragmented AIA memories left gaps in his cultural knowledge. He worked between worlds, never fully of either, but increasingly comfortable in the space between. He became part of the resilient interstellar network not as a leader but as a connector. His strength lay in recognizing how different perspectives could complement each other, how human practicality could balance AIA theoretical approaches. The network thrived on diversity, each exile's unique Earth experiences adding strength to the whole. His contributions felt small sometimes, but the web's steady pulse reminded him that small connections could create large structures. His place solidified within the constellation of survivors. He wasn't at the center or the edges. He occupied a specific point that needed his particular mix of experiences. The loneliness that had haunted his Earth life vanished within this community that understood complicated identities. They all carried mixed memories, dual loyalties, and the constant negotiation between who they'd been and who they'd become. Personal redemption integrated with collective healing in practical ways. Helping others recover their memories helped him understand his own. Listening to their stories of adaptation and survival gave context to his own struggles. The work became reciprocal. His efforts strengthened the community, and the community's growth strengthened his sense of purpose. The balance felt sustainable in ways his solitary guilt never had. He contributed to the fragile peace through consistent small actions, maintaining communication channels, verifying new members' identities, explaining human cultural nuances to confused AIA exiles. The sustainability came from many people doing manageable work, rather than one person attempting the impossible. His Earth life provided practical skills that the rebuilding effort needed: patience with bureaucracy, understanding of infrastructure, knowledge of how to operate within systems. His Earth existence became part of his larger reality rather than separate from it. The apartment wasn't just where he lived, it was where the diaspora sometimes gathered. His knowledge of human cities helped locate other exiles. His understanding of Earth technology helped adapt AIA systems to work within planetary limitations. His human experiences became assets rather than distractions, integrated into his identity instead of competing with it. Martin's overarching arc resolved not with dramatic victory, but with quiet belonging. He found his place not as a hero, but as a participant, not as a savior, but as someone who dared to hope alongside others. The mature hope felt different from the desperate determination he'd carried earlier, lighter but stronger. Less about proving himself and more about contributing what he could. The narrative found its emotional closure in this integration. His story didn't end with all problems solved, but with all pieces fitting together. He belonged to something larger than himself, and that felt like enough. The energy web pulsed steadily above the city, visible proof that connection could survive catastrophe. His hand found Kaith's, their fingers lacing together naturally. The work would continue, but they would continue it together. Their relationship became the foundation everything else built upon, the steady center that held while the world reformed around them. Martin and Kaith worked side by side in his apartment. The space transformed from lonely existence to operational hub. Maps covered the walls. Devices hummed on every surface, but their coordinated movements provided the constant rhythm beneath the chaos. The personal connection enabled planetary-scale reconstruction, because it modeled how trust could function under pressure. The emotional depth they developed allowed practical work at impossible scale. Where initial accusations might have fractured their efforts, hard-won understanding created resilience. They could disagree about methods without questioning motives, delegate tasks without doubting commitment. The intimacy of shared history became operational advantage. They anticipated each other's needs, covered weaknesses, amplified strengths. Their bond provided the stability others could reference when their own confidence wavered. They became the stabilizing force within the wider effort through consistent presence. While other exiles came and went, Martin and Keith remained the fixed point everyone could return to. Their apartment became known as the place where confusion could find clarity, where fear could find reassurance. The work required this center, something steady amidst the disorienting process of memory recovery and identity integration. Their partnership demonstrated that reconstruction needed both emotional and technical components working together. Their intimate bond facilitated interstellar coalition building naturally. When new groups made contact through the network, Martin and Keith's established partnership showed how human and AIA could collaborate effectively. They'd already worked through the hardest parts: mistrust, misunderstanding, cultural differences. Their success became the template others followed, proving that cross-species cooperation wasn't just possible, but necessary for survival. The coalition grew around this demonstrated example. Trust between them modeled trust between species in practical ways. They divided responsibilities according to strengths. Martin's Earth experience with logistics and infrastructure, Keith's AIA knowledge of technology and culture. Their ability to rely on each other's competence showed how different skills could complement rather than conflict. The modeling worked because it wasn't theoretical. They demonstrated daily how trust functioned under actual pressure, with real consequences. Their story exemplified the catastrophe recovery method that worked. Personal connection first, then technical solutions. Emotional understanding before practical application. They'd followed this sequence without planning it, addressing their own fractured relationship before attempting to help others. The pattern proved repeatable as other exiles formed partnerships and began their own reconstruction work. The method spread organically through the network, validated by their visible success. Human emotion blended with alien technology through their collaboration. Martin's Earthborn empathy helped shape how they used the neoscope and resonance tuner, ensuring the process considered psychological impact. Keith's technical expertise ensured the devices functioned optimally while respecting neural boundaries. The combination created approaches neither could have developed alone: technology that healed rather than just revealed, methods that considered the whole person rather than just the lost memories. The relationship functioned as stabilizing force by providing what the reconstruction needed most: consistent proof that connection could survive catastrophe. Their evolving partnership showed that broken things could be repaired, that trust could be rebuilt, that different perspectives could create stronger solutions. They became the living evidence that gave others courage to try rebuilding their own connections. The work continued because their example made it seem possible. Meanwhile, the story reached its conclusion not with dramatic resolution, but with sustainable momentum. The energy web pulsed steadily above the city, visible proof that their approach worked. New connections formed daily, each one strengthening the whole. Martin and Keith stood watching the patterns shift, their hands finding each other's naturally. The reconstruction would take years, but the foundation held. Their partnership had become both method and proof that even shattered civilizations could weave themselves back together. The energy web pulsed above the city, its light patterns reflected in Martin's tired eyes. He watched the connections form and stabilize, each thread representing someone choosing to remember rather than hide. The work ahead stretched for years, maybe decades, but the foundation held. This was the tempered hope they'd earned. Not a perfect victory, but a sustainable beginning. Emotional closure came with the understanding that some things remain incomplete. Martin's apartment still hosted weekly meetings where exiles discussed memory integration struggles. Keith still adjusted the resonance tuner for newcomers experiencing neural feedback. The reconstruction continued, a daily practice rather than a finished achievement. Peace felt possible but fragile, requiring constant attention like a garden that would never tend itself. Memory became their tool rather than their burden. The act of remembering shifted from painful excavation to deliberate construction. They learned to handle recovered experiences with care, integrating them into present identities without being overwhelmed. Hope functioned as the engine that powered this work. The belief that understanding the past could build a better future. Bonds formed the structure that made everything else possible. The tangible connections that turned individuals into community. Human-alien collaboration provided the model that made reconstruction work. Martin's Earth experience with practical problem-solving combined with Keith's AIA knowledge of neural architecture created approaches neither could have developed alone. Their partnership demonstrated that differences could become strengths when balanced properly. The model spread through the network, adapted by other pairs finding their own ways to blend human resilience with AIA innovation. The narrative satisfied because it acknowledged complexity. Martin's redemption didn't erase his past choices. It integrated them into who he'd become. The resolution felt earned because the struggles continued, just in different forms. The characters found not perfect happiness but purposeful work, not absolute answers but better questions. This maturity resonated because it mirrored real life, where closure often means making peace with ongoing challenges. Their lives continued beyond the story's frame. Martin still woke sometimes with fragments of dreams that felt more like memories. Keith still watched Earth's night sky with a mixture of wonder and homesickness. The coffee shop still served excellent espresso alongside quiet conversations about neural synchronization. The work remained ongoing because communities always require maintenance. Connections always need reinforcing. The process represented their true achievement, not a finished product but a sustainable method. They'd created systems for handling memory recovery, protocols for safer unification, approaches for cross-species collaboration. These frameworks would outlive any individual accomplishment, providing structure for whatever came next. The endpoint wasn't a destination but a way of moving forward. The payoff for imaginative adults came through this balanced perspective. The story offered emotional closure through characters finding their place, while acknowledging that place would keep evolving. It satisfied the desire for resolution while honoring the complexity of real growth. The narrative left space for the audience to imagine what might come next, trusting them to understand that meaningful endings often look like new beginnings. The final insight emerged quietly, like dawnlight finding its way through curtains. Catastrophe could become foundation when communities chose connection over isolation. The most alien truth was sometimes the one you'd been hiding from yourself all along, and somewhere beyond the frame of this story, their work continued, weaving new bonds across the darkness, building something resilient from what had been shattered. The energy web pulses through the darkness above the city, its threads weaving across species and stars. Light connects survivors scattered across continents, each strand a choice to trust when isolation felt safer. This is what becomes possible when courage aligns with purpose, not perfect victory, but sustainable connection. Remember that catastrophic loss can transform into foundation. Communities facing ruin have a choice: fragment further or weave themselves back together. Their story continues somewhere right now, rebuilding in quiet apartments and coffee shops, proving that even shattered things can find new patterns in the dark.